Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to speak to what is essentially the government's Omnibus Transportation Act or bill. And so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to hit on all the points of what's contemplated in this bill because there's just frankly too much. It goes and changes laws having to do with everything from shipping to railways to the airline. It changes a number of different acts and with a number of different purposes in mind. And so I would say that I think, just for starters, that it would have been better to break this bill up into its component pieces so that they could be studied properly and on theme, if you will, rather than trying to rush it all through at once. And I would remind members of the House that debate in this place isn't just for the sake of opposition politicians or even backbench MPs on the government side being able to talk a lot. What happens when we're talking in this chamber and during the time that it takes to pass a bill is also Canadians in civil society learning about what's in the bill and being able to form a judgment about whether they think it's a good idea or not, and having the time to be able to mobilize either in support or against aspects of the government program. So I think it's important when we talk about criticizing omnibus bills, it's not just for the sake of members in this House that want to go on talking. While we talk about that bill, Canadians are talking about it too. And they're getting a chance to weigh in, and they're able to contact us and become, through us in this place, part of the debate here. So when governments lump a whole bunch of significant changes together and ran them through Parliament, they're not just cutting out parliamentarians from that debate. That's the time it takes in order to be able to have a meaningful civil engagement with respect to changes. This bill contemplates many significant changes in a number of different areas of transport within Canada. I'm particularly concerned, as someone who comes from a rail town, about the provisions on that purport to be about railway safety. But actually what they're about is supervising workers in the workplace and tramping on their right to privacy in the workplace, Mr. Speaker. Because we know that in terms of railway safety, the predominant issue has to do with fatigue management. And what we hear time and time again from people who are actually working on the trains is that railway companies in Canada are doing a very poor job of fatigue management, and we know that that's having real consequences for Canadians and the extent to which they feel safe in their own communities. And a government that was genuinely sincere about wanting to do something for railway safety in this country, Mr. Speaker, would be taking action on the issue of fatigue management. But that would require actually getting involved in telling the railway companies something they don't want to hear. And what we've seen from this government is that they're not willing to stand up to big companies and tell them what they don't want to hear. That's certainly true of railway companies. It's not just true of railway companies. It was true when Bay Street corporate magnates came down to Parliament Hill and told the Liberals to break their promise on closing the CEO stock option loophole. It was true when Air Canada came knocking and said that they wanted to be off the hook for when they broke the law and exported the maintenance work on their planes that rightfully belong to Canadian maintenance workers. And the government retroactively changed the law. And shame on certain members of this House. I'm thinking of some colleagues of mine from Winnipeg, particularly the Winnipeg North, who stood with those workers and said that the previous government should enforce the law. He then became part of a government that changed the law and pulled the carpet out from beneath the feet of those workers who were successfully challenging Air Canada in court. So it's a theme, Mr. Speaker. It's a theme of the Liberals playing pushover to big companies, and the provisions around railway safety in this Act are no different, Mr. Speaker. It's railway companies that have come to them and said, let's not talk about fatigue management, let's talk about putting video and audio surveillance in the cabs of trains so that we can watch the workers. Because if they were sincere about making it a safety issue, there would be provisions in this Act that said that only the Transportation Safety Board would have access to those recordings. And they would only have access to them when something happened, to go back and to find out what was the root cause of an incident so that they could rule on that. But instead, this legislation would give that 24/7 surveillance material to the companies anytime they like, for whatever purpose they like. So it's hard to believe that this is really about railway safety when the government is silent on the real issue, facing railways and railway communities when it comes to their safety, and is giving unfettered access to that material for employers that we know will be able to use that information for other purposes. The other thing about omnibus bills is that for as much as certain things that require more legislation and more study don't get that study, they also, by mingling issues, make it the case that some things where there's actually widespread agreement, like for instance some of the provisions on in this bill for grain producers on the prairies that in part because of the elimination of the wheat board now need a legislative fix in order for them to be able to get a fair price for shipping their grain. Those provisions where there is more agreement don't get passed as quickly as they might. And the problem with this legislation is that the Liberals took so long to take action on that particular issue, which was not a surprise, and didn't have to wait on developing, you know, to the extent that they did, which is, and it's not a very fulsome air passenger Bill of Rights, but to the extent that they were putting all these issues together because they wanted to present it in an omnibus bill, they took far too long to address a real problem on the Canadian prairies for grain growers. So now we're going to have a gap between when the old rules that were in place as a bit of a band-aid solution to be able to help those grain producers on the prairies and when these new rules come in. If they weren't so committed to omnibus legislation, what they could have done was introduce those measures separately. And I think they would have found that they would have had enough agreement to be able to expedite passage of those provisions, because on this side of the House, we care about Western grain growers, and we want to make sure that they can get a fair price for shipping their grain, Mr. Speaker. But because the Liberals wanted to tie all these issues together in order to be able to conflate the issues and say that opposition parties are opposing good pieces of the legislation or supporting bad pieces of the legislation because it's all tied together. So in other words, in order to cover their political behind, Mr. Speaker, Canadian grain producers are the ones that are going to suffer. And I think it's wrong of the government to ask Canadian grain growers to essentially pay for some political cover for the government. And that's a big part of what's going on in here. I just want to take a moment to thank the member for Windsor West, not only for sharing his time with me today, but also for the work that he did on the Air Passenger Bill of Rights. He actually helped to develop a substantive Air Passenger Bill of Rights, and I'll recognize also one of my NDP predecessors for Elmwood Transcona, Jim Malloway, who did good work on an Air Passenger Bill of Rights, who paved the way and presented a bill in the last Parliament that the now Minister of Transport actually supported. But do we see in here, this took forever to produce, Mr. Speaker, and the changes that were necessary to actually protect consumers were spelled out in that bill, a bill the Minister of Transport supported. But do you see the substance of that bill represented in this omnibus piece of legislation? No, you don't. So this is just how complicated omnibus legislation gets. Canadian grain growers were waiting for legislation to fix a legitimate problem the government knew about since it took office, so that the Liberals could come up with a lame phantom version of an Air Passenger Bill of Rights that was already developed, while they were really just having discussions with the railway on how to institute 24/7 surveillance so that they could know about the issues that were being discussed in the workplace between workers who are a member of the union and want to file grievances or take other issues with their employer. That's how muddled it all gets when you take things that have absolutely nothing to do with each other and ram them all into the same bill. And that's really what's going on with this bill, Mr. Speaker. It's a big kind of tossed salad of different legislative measures, some of which the government probably could have found widespread agreement on in order to be able to advance quickly, some of which is just sort of a hollow version of previous legislation that they have no excuse for having taken this long in order to get around to, and actually had they adopted more substantive provisions probably would have found more widespread agreement. And all that's going on so that they can work with certain companies, in this case I would say particularly rail companies, in order to be able to do something that has nothing to do with rail safety and everything to do with employers at the railway being able to put employees under their thumb, Mr. Speaker. It's a travesty.
Questions and comments from the honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his presentation, and I was very interested in a lot of the stuff he had to say. And I totally agree with him. I mean, 13 acts on 3 modes of transportation, it's ridiculous. I mean, you'd think the Liberals wouldn't care anything about Parliament. They just want to ram this thing through. And it's absolutely disgusting to see what's happening here with such an important matter, whether it's air traffic, whether it's rail traffic, whatever. But you did mention some good points there, and it was on the safety. And there was we haven't had the opportunity to have any real good debate here, good discussion, and that's what we're here for. We're here to talk about the safety of rail transportation, but what I'm more interested in is the safety of our communities where the railways go through, and the safety for the people working on the railways. And we're not having that opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to speak. And I just want to give a quick example, and I'd like ask my honourable friend to answer this. In my community, we see the super trains. Large trains of grain, large trains of oil tankers, large trains of containers, and they come into the small communities from one side of Canada to the other side of Canada. They block crossings. People can't get to and from the communities. People can't get to the hospital. People can't get to work, sometimes for hours on end because the trains sit during the shuffling of the other train going east or west. I wonder if the member would just comment on that situation, because I know it's happening in his riding, it's happening in every member's riding in this country, and it is a danger to Canadians. Thank you.
For Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, and the member's quite right. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to rail safety. The length of trains is certainly part of that, and the NDP and my father in this place before me has a long record of fighting for appropriately lengthed trains. And it's been a tradition in Canada that the trains continue to get longer and longer and longer. That has an economic impact because for the goods and services that aren't moving on the train, it means significant delays. There's safety delays involved when it comes to getting to hospital. And it's another example of successive Liberal and Conservative governments that just haven't been willing to stand up to the railways and say, I'm sorry, but you guys are changing your practices in a way that are having serious negative effects on communities, and we're telling you to stop it because you can still make money by running shorter trains. You can't tell us that it's not economically viable to run reasonably length trains. When we talk about fatigue management, that's a serious issue. I spoke to that a little bit earlier. We've got issues in my own backyard, the Community Mission Gardens. There was a new underpass built. Now we've got the railway has decided unilaterally that they're going to start marshalling trains on the main line between the shops and the yards where they never used to. We've got people that lived in the community for 30, 40 years are now saying they've got cracked windows, they've got cracks in their foundation, they've got diesel fumes in their home, pictures are falling off the wall, and the government is not willing to get involved to tell the railway that they can't make those kinds of unilateral decisions, and the communities are not going to be forced to bear the consequences of the decisions that railways make in their own economic self-interest without any regard to what's going on in the community. And it's high time we had a government in this country that's willing to play tough with the railways and let them know they're not the only people using the land in Canada. There's people that live by their tracks and they have to respect them.
Time for one more short question and response. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, being in the transportation, formerly being in the transportation industry for over 22 years, I've got a lot of questions regarding C-49. Going back to in terms of the airside part of this bill, the bill doesn't specify what the compensation levels for passengers would be under this Passengers Bill of Rights. That causes concerns. But one that I haven't seen in here, and I want to ask our honourable colleague through you, Mr. Speaker, is just a week ago we were debating the Liberals' legalization of cannabis, the use of cannabis, and I spoke at length about my concerns of how that's going to impact the transportation sector. Now we have an omnibus bill, and we've got Bill C-49 here, Transportation Modernization Act, but I haven't seen anything with respect to drug use, drug policy, and specifically cannabis addressed into this, and I'm wondering if our honourable colleague has an answer for that as well.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, and a quick two-point answer. So on the first issue that he raised, one of the virtues of the NDP proposed legislation on an air passenger Bill of Rights was that it did stipulate what the penalty would be, that passengers who had their flight canceled on them or they couldn't get on board the plane would be entitled to a full refund. And if the airline wasn't compliant, that they would pay a $1,000 penalty to the passenger on top of that full refund. And so there are ways of doing this. There's ways that Liberals in the past, who are now in the government, have supported in the past, and they simply decided not to include them. And I think he raises a fair point, that there are a lot of other moving pieces when it comes to government legislation. One of the virtues of giving time to be able to study them is to ask those questions about how interrelated issues are addressed within different pieces of legislation. And if we had more time, then those kinds of questions are questions that we could get into in greater detail. As it is, I haven't even talked about any of the shipping provisions in the bill.